Imagine sending a tweet and seeing your message blossom on massive trees of light. Data visualizations that help you grasp the vast diversity present in subatomic particles, the tiniest sample of water, or an urban green space. An entire rural mountain town transformed into a multimedia expression of art, activism, and community. Through the art of collaboration, Agnes Chavez helps make all these future visions real. And through them, she engages students across the world through curricula, installations, and online activities.
Welcome to Augmented Humanity. Our guests are modern explorers working at the intersection of technology and the humanities. They help us to understand ourselves and the worlds we create in this digital age. They are thinkers, creators, makers, and academics working in diverse fields like linguistics, technology, game and object design, and ethics. I'm your host, Craig Goldsmith.
I'm your host, Ellen Dornan.
On this program, we're joined by artist and educator Agnes Chavez, who explores the interrelationship between art, science, technology, and nature as a process and tool for social change. As an artist, her work focuses on data visualization, light, sound, and space. As a curriculum developer, she applies the latest arts, science, and technological innovations to youth programming and education. She is a founding member of the PASEO Festival and the founder of the STEMarts LAB. The lab's STEMarts curriculum tool is an online platform that complements real-world science and art festivals with STEAM activities and resources. She is also the developer of the SUBE multisensory language curriculum for teaching Spanish and English to kids through art, music, and games. Agnes, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Before we get into some of the real nitty-gritty of the work that you've been doing and some of these organizations and efforts that you've had a part in founding and collaborating on, if you could just give us a quick picture of your work as an artist and as an educator and collaborator generally.
Yes, I'm foremost an artist, a sci artist. My work is inspired by science. And I combine art, science, and technology for social change, ecological challenges, addressing some real-world issues usually. I create youth projects that evolve from this art research and exploration. Then I'm also a collaborator. I collaborate with festivals, science labs, and arts organizations to create youth programs, all based on this methodology of combining art, science, and technology for some social, ecological cause.
When you say sci-art, could you just give an example of what that would be for someone who might not have any idea what that means?
I sometimes think about that, because now the new word is STEAM. So STEAM is science and technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics. But even before that, there was always the sci-art movement, which started way back in the 60s and the 70s. It's that when artists and scientists collaborate on projects together. So it doesn't talk about all those other aspects like engineering and mathematics. That developed more in the educational field as a response to the fact that science and art were lagging behind in this country at a certain point. But sci-art is really the original movement of an interdisciplinary collaboration between artists and scientists.
If I was just a lay person standing in front of a sci-art project, what might that look like?
So from my art, what is an example of sci-art? So for me, what I do is I collaborate with scientists to inform the work. And so I've been a particle physics enthusiast since the 80s. And so for the past 20 years, I've been really working with particle physicists. For me, one of my installations like origination point or fluidic data is to find a way to visualize in a multisensory experiential way, not just the science in the sense of the data behind it, but the possible impact it can have on you as a person when you understand these science concepts. So when I learned about the Big Bang and when I learned about the Higgs boson particle, it fires up my imagination. And I see the implications of it in the real world. So when I learn about a new scientific idea or a theory, I want to find a way to create art that allows people to understand it in a sensorial way. So for me, one of my sci-art installations, you'll look at it and you won't maybe think that it's science, but it actually is communicating science concepts. First, by using the technology that's possible because of the science, and second, visualizing the ideas in the work.
But in a way that you hope is evocative and has an emotional impact.
Exactly.
It seems like in some cases, some of your installations, and I'm thinking of your fluidic data installation at CERN, which takes data from the Large Hadron Collider and feeds it into the art itself. So it's an ongoing expression of work in progress. And as the scientists move through their building, they can actually see what's going on with their experiments through your art.
It was a unique opportunity because it was designed with the scientists. And it was the first time that CERN had brought in an artist to work with physicists in this way. So it wasn't just the art, like Origination Point was me. I had no one to answer to, and I got to create my own installation, which showed at the Havana Biennale. And it was about and informed and inspired by particle physics. But fluidic data, I had to work with them, and they were very particular about the data being correct and how the particles were being visualized. It was a huge collaboration that took almost 3 years.
What's your original background? Do you come from an art background? Did you get a degree in physics? Did you do both?
Good question. I have completely an art background. My parents always said I was an artist since I was 3. I was doodling and making pictures. They knew I was going to be an artist, and they always supported it. Then I went to art school, and I graduated in '84. The world was a different place back then, and I was always interested in technology. And so I think the science track started when I discovered holography in 1984. And then I went to New York after I graduated from California College of Arts and Crafts, and I went to study at the New York Holographic Laboratory. I took some holography workshops with the 2 pioneers of holography, Dan Schweitzer and Sam Murray. They're the ones that turned me on to particle physics. Holographers are really tuned into that. I don't have a science background. Science and math are not my forte. But over the years, because of the concepts behind particle physics, I became obsessed with it. And so it was kind of like that, lurking in the background, kind of inspiring my work all the way up until I started working with CERN. And that's because I said to myself at one point, it's time for me to really go deep and do some research and find out what's pseudoscience, what's new age science, and what's real science. Because I was thinking I can't tell the difference anymore from reading all the layman's books. And so that's when I asked to do a research day at CERN, and that started me on the path to really getting into where I am now, which is about science literacy. And I'm really into now using my art to communicate science literacy, and especially in this particular time that we're living in right now with science denialism going on.
Denialism? I love that turn of phrase.
Did I just make that up?
I know some of your more recent projects, like the Biota project that was part of the Species in Peril exhibition, or your current project, the Pollinator Concentrator, are much more drifting into the realm of biology. I mean, does that compel you in the same way?
First of all, to clarify and give some credit out there, so Pollinator Concentrator is the art piece of the artist Anna MacArthur. So as I mentioned, I create youth projects from my own art research, but then I also work and design youth programs where I select artists to be part of the program and then build a curriculum around the artist. So BioSTEAM is the move towards biology. So I started to go to Portugal and came across a woman and a group of artists that were doing bioart. And this really made me see a whole other realm that I was not aware of before. The shift in science from particle physics and physics to biology is happening. And so there's a lot of research now and a lot of breakthroughs are happening. So that's kind of new, So for example, DNA sequencing, which I incorporated into Biota. And it's all connected. And the exciting thing about biology is it's easier for students to connect it to the real world because we're talking about the earth and nature and plants and trees. Whereas all those years of trying to communicate particle physics, I realized how much harder it was.
It's kind of abstract.
Very abstract.
Especially for a young person, yeah.
Yes, so that was always a big challenge. I've always been an abstract thinker, and some of the kids are, but a lot of the kids are not.
After having worked at the intersection of arts and sciences, crunching huge volumes of data and making it visible and impactful, what do you feel like is the important thing that arises out of that intersection?
When I showed Origination Point, which was my first time visualizing particle physics concepts, so it was very complex if you read it, but when you walked in, it was a full installation. So there was someone that came up to me and said that they felt it here in their stomach, that they really felt it. And that was a huge compliment for me, and that I was on the right track. And at the same time, a physicist, a particle physicist, a very strict particle physicist, not connected with art in any way, said to me, this is really amazing. She really got the physics part of it. Or when I took Origination Point to Cuba, and everyone from the people that were cleaning the space to artists related to the piece. So I think that's important to me because I'm trying to reach all kinds of people and not just in the art community or in the science community. So I'm always looking for that.
The artists have a lot to bring to the world of science, but how do the scientists feed back into what the artists are doing?
When I started working on fluidic data with the scientists, I heard that a lot. Oh, well, the artists get a lot out of it. What do we get out of it? Why the fluidic data was different for CERN is because it was the first time that they decided to do it differently, where you work with the scientists. So together you design something. It's not the same as just going and getting inspired and then the artist just goes back to their studio and does whatever. So that question came up a lot. And so I feel like because I worked with Johann Bonilla at the very beginning, who was getting his PhD, and then now he's actually working at CERN, we sat together, and he was one of those physicists that could understand both languages very well. And I already had experience and time working with physicists, so we kind of could understand each other's language a little bit. And so that created a very unique collaboration. And his goal, too, was he wanted this installation to be not just for the visitor, but also for the physicists that work there, because the installation is in a stairwell that is mostly 90% of the time just the people that work there are going up and down. So he wanted it to be that a physicist could geek out on it. So it has that. It has different layers. So, for example, every pod, every one of the 54 pods represents a particle. You know how many particles there are in the universe. So we got these main ones, and they light up when they are actually activated according to the statistical data from the LHC. A physicist could get a lot more out of it, but the average person can also just get their level of understanding from it.
Given that the focus of this program is the humanities in the broadest sense, I feel like scientists, mathematicians, engineers are in such a better position to justify their work, to get funding for their work, to combat science denialism if you can explain why your work is important, why it's deeply meaningful and connected to what else is going on.
Since I'm also a curriculum developer and an educator, I learned way back about the multiple intelligence theory and the fact that we all have different strengths in our way of thinking and the way of communicating. It still blows my mind. Howard Gardner, who invented multiple intelligence theory, keeps coming up with new ones. So there's the ninth. It was 8 intelligences. And now the ninth one is existentialism. So it's the innate ability and strength in being able to contemplate the universe. And these are people who become priests or become philosophers. And I thought, isn't that fascinating? Of course, all of these you can develop. There are many skills that I've had to develop, like I'm not strong in math, right? But there are things that you're naturally born with. So he maybe didn't have that intelligence so fully developed yet, but it doesn't mean he can't develop it. And I definitely have the existentialism because I'm always contemplating, the why and the how and the universe and where we come from, which is why I'm attracted to physics. If you go to the CERN website, the mission statement is to understand the nature of reality. I was like, this is my place.
And explaining that reality is in some ways the work of the artist.
I have always thought it was to the detriment of science to separate itself from the humanities, because science doesn't happen in a moral and ethical vacuum.
That's right.
And integrating that more, I think, would benefit everybody. But I think also there's something about your art and the projects that you've worked on, Agnes, that really show the interrelatedness of phenomena, that it's not just going to be particles doing things. It's particles doing things, and it makes other particles do things. It's not just water. There's water with all these microbes and all this life that even though we can't see it, it's there. And I think showing how much bigger any one thing is a really sort of important impact for me of your art. To me, that's not something that comes out of reading a scientific journal.
That's right. The artist does have that strength, which is why when you bring together an artist and a scientist, and lately I've been bringing in cultural specialists, indigenous cultural specialists, like you were saying about the ethics. for social cause means humanitarian, ecological, social, even personal development, right? All of that. It's the humanities. So bringing in like an indigenous cultural specialist, their worldview inherently does not see science and art as separate. They don't even have a word for science, which is why it's so hard for people to look at indigenous culture and say there's a science. But it's because everything is science and art. What they call natives in science, which I believe was coined by Dr. Greg Cajete, who is an advisor on our curriculum and for youth programs. He's at UNM. He's an author of 7 books. And this one book on native science really opened my mind to it. And I've always gone back to it and used it to inform the curriculum because that's what needs to happen. And I believe it is happening on a certain level. The whole interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, it's starting to see that we can't just see things from one point of view, one way of knowing. And so if we just act in our little bubbles and don't care about how it's impacting another discipline or something else in the planet, then that's when you get the problems that we're in. That is another thing that I'm always making sure is communicated. And you can see it as a thread in all of the work.
You're listening to Augmented Humanity. We'll be back in just a minute. Welcome back to Augmented Humanity.
Thank you so much for taking time to talk with us today, Agnes. I wanted to pick apart a little bit the art of collaboration. Some of your work started out as sort of artist installations, and it seems like you've expanded more and more into doing community work, to working with students, providing resources and materials and activities to kids homeschooling all over, way beyond Taos. So tell me a little bit about where you see collaboration fitting into art and science education.
I would say that collaboration is really an art form. I really see it as an art form. It's been there all along. Even very early on, when I developed the SUBE language curriculum, I was doing collaborations there, working with musicians to develop the music, bringing the kids to the high school to hear the ranchera music being played. Always I integrate different sectors of the community and do community outreach through education. It never, ever for me is an isolated unit, right? And in terms of how it applies to the art, science, and technology, it's even more critical because the way technology advances every second, there's a new update, a new app, a new learning program, a new conflict between browsers or whatever. It's never ending. And then you see all these exciting tools that you want to use. You want to use them all. You want VR. Now there's MR and AR and XR. And it's just, yes, 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 give it all. I want to do them all. And the thing is, you can't do it all yourself. And I would have to select one and then study it deeply to really do it myself. And that's not the way my brain works. The purpose is to create connection with people and create something that requires a lot more than just one program could fulfill. I remember the day when I decided I was going to get into new media arts, because remember, I'm graduated in '84 before there was even World Wide Web. I remember my son was like middle school, and I had to decide whether I was going to go back and get my master's in new media arts. And you know what? That's when I said, there's another way to do this. And I said, collaborate, because I have lots of ideas. They just are a dime a dozen for me in my head. And it's like, how are you going to realize them fast so that you can move on to the next idea? And collaboration is the best way to do that. So over the years, I've just developed strategies for how to collaborate. And I've learned, things that worked and didn't work. And the art of collaboration takes a lot. learning how to work with people and how do you identify the right person? How do you know which program to use and therefore which person is the best for that program? On and on. There's a lot to it. And that's what I've really been doing all these years.
Well, and there's the part that is, how do you get people to collaborate with you? And I imagine that the artist-scientist collaboration is particularly fraught because of maybe judgment about how seriously you're taking the work as an artist.
What really, I think, helped is that I have always been an artist/educator. And scientists can relate to education. So when I approached CERN, it was not for art. It was for education. It was for STEMarts LAB. It was because I was looking for a physicist at CERN that could be my mentor and work with me to develop this project, which is called Projecting Particles, which is the kids use projection art to explore particle physics and communicate particle physics concepts. The woman who started the arts residency at CERN, Ariana Kirk, when I was working for Isaiah, I invited her to be a keynote speaker for the education program, and she came and talked about arts at CERN. And she said, whenever you're in the area in Geneva, call me for a cup of coffee. So I did. And I met with her, and she's wonderful, of course. And I said, I'm looking for a physicist to work with me on this project. And she said, I know the perfect person, Dr. Stephen Goldfarb. And I've been working with Steve ever since on this project. And so because we had already worked for years, they've accepted the Projecting Particles project. They acknowledge it. It is meeting all of the scientific accuracy because I don't do anything without checking. Steve is used to getting emails from me constantly. It's about scientific literacy and so forth, and that helps because they know that I'm always concerned about that and working on that, and that they're going to have a say.
With that in mind, you talked about the kids doing this kind of work. So who are these kids that are using the STEM arts curriculum?
STEMarts LAB is the organization. So we do workshops, I develop online curriculum, I do collaborations with artists. Many things happen within that.
So who are these kids?
So, it started here in Taos, where I live and where I've been based for 30 plus years. And so Taos has always been my guinea pig. So the kids here are my guinea pigs. But, throughout, I've also done workshops at the Hispanic Cultural Center. So I would say all of northern New Mexico, Santa Fe and Albuquerque. And then I took the program to Havana, where I worked with Cuban kids, and they participated in it. And now I'm developing an international exchange program, and I'm going to be working with kids all over the world. Guadalajara, Mexico, Lisbon, Portugal. We're talking to Tunisia. So eventually, through the online virtual platform world that we live in now, I'll be able to really bring this to so many more kids than was possible before. So I work with 4th grade through 12th grade. So it's middle and high, but I sometimes go down because I love 4th and 5th graders. And I've had teachers that are like, my kids can do it. So I started to 4th graders.
How do you actually connect with them? I mean, in Taos, I see where you might go into the local school and you probably have those long relationships at this point. But you were talking about these other groups of kids that are now all over the world. So how do they actually end up intersecting with you, or their teachers, I guess, intersecting with you to start with? I'm presuming it probably starts with the teachers.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because I consider that one of my strategies is that I'm always talking about the kids because the kids are the ones that are going to benefit, but really it's also the teachers. I don't have a program like after school for just kids. I actually work with schools because that's how you can have more impact. So if you work with one teacher, that teacher has 20 to 30 kids every year. So I did this with the SUBE curriculum too. I developed a teacher's curriculum. And STEM arts really is very teacher focused in that sense. So through the schools, the kids get access to it. And then I try to include as many schools as possible. I mean, in the beginning, I would just approach schools directly, but the other way I've always done it is through festivals. So with festivals, like Isaiah was the first festival where I brought this programming. Before that, I didn't do festivals. I was just working directly with schools. And now you can reach a lot more through a festival. And in Taos, since I've been doing the PASEO for 5 or 6 years, I was able to really get every school in the district into it, because every year we do the same thing, and it was a certain time it was going to happen, and they put it in their schedule. And so we really had impact over that 6-year period that I was there. So we're talking 10 schools in the district and one teacher group. So usually be a science teacher and an art teacher or the STEAM teacher. It could be any subject. It didn't have to be art. Any teacher that wanted to do it could do it. And so that's another way. And then now a new way that I'm doing it is through the International Exchange Program, working with the US embassies. And the US embassies identify the schools. But again, schools. And then once they find the school, they always find the champion teacher, which is another strategy. You can't just offer it in a flyer and say, anybody want to do this? No. You got to find that champion teacher, the one that gets it. And one of the teachers I want to mention is Avena Bowers, who I worked with for years in Taos, and now she's in Santa Fe. And I just have to text her and go, oh my God, I got this great idea. We're going to do this. And this just sounds crazy. And she's like, yes, sign me up. These teachers are the ones that have to find a way to bring these big projects, interdisciplinary projects, into the 20th century classroom with rows of desks and all the different subjects. If you're the art teacher, how are you going to teach science and all of this? And if you're the science teacher, how are you going to bring art into your class? They have to resolve all of that. So it's a collaboration with the teacher as well. There's no way I could do this without the buy-in and the passion of the teacher.
Well, and it's sort of an interesting time also to have this sort of curricula out there, because I know so many teachers are casting around right now, this year in 2020, for ready-to-go tested curricula that they can deploy in an online virtual environment.
Yeah, the STEMarts curriculum tool was started in 2012, but I do believe that now is when it's really going to be used because of that. Before, one of the main challenges of implementing these kinds of programs in the school was teachers not being used to accessing things virtually, technology, and so forth. But now
it's a job requirement.
I have a captive audience.
Yeah, totally.
So yes, finally they're catching up. I can do it. I can work with them now. So I did my first professional development training with 10 different schools and like 18 teachers. And at the end, they told me, thank you for these resources. So I think it's a good time.
Well, and I think there's an important aspect of engaging students with learning that they're going to own. Like they need to be self-directed to a certain extent. It seems like some of the work that they can do through the STEMarts LAB would engage a student in that intrinsically motivated learning.
Exactly. That's one of the things that I have always focused on is that when I say science, when I talk about sci-art or the science in STEAM, I'm not talking about just textbook science. Okay, that's another thing I want to clarify. I'm talking about cutting edge, cool science that I think is pretty cool. Like, for example, the latest one I'm into is quantum dots. I'm working with a chemist that works in nanotechnology applied to solar panels, but she also is really interested in collaborating with artists, right? So her specialty is seeing how quantum dots can improve the efficiency of a solar cell. So I started to look around and I found this do-it-yourself through YouTube, make your own quantum dots with a microwave and some like household products, right? Sugar and vinegar, whatever. I said, test this out. Let me know if it works. So she tested it out. She showed me the first look. You can make quantum dots. It glows. And so we're going to incorporate quantum dots in the next workshop. So these are really cool things, and the kids that have participated, they are really super jazzed. They are super jazzed. You got to provide stuff that's real, not just textbook stuff.
What I've seen with some of the students participating as part of the PASEO Festival is that students really took the opportunity to use these platforms or these technologies in whatever ways, not necessarily to explore hard science, but as a way of sort of incorporating data or science into telling their own stories. And I saw kids expressing advocacy and activism, and I saw kids talking about their land and their water, and I saw kids exploring their neighborhoods and their immediate environs through these different sort of technology-based artistic platforms. When you're working with students, do you encourage them to run with it? Do you see it firing people's imaginations?
Yeah, in the case of when it's done through these champion teachers who implement, I also see what they're doing with it. Like, for example, Nat Evans over at Taos Charter School, who's a science teacher, works with Katie Willowell, who's an art teacher. When they learned from Christopher Chahosky how to use these Dynalite microscopes, which allow them to take leaves and things and see them in a microscope. and then they created these kaleidoscopic images from them. I saw how they went on to do other things with that microscope. And every year now they include it into their work. So it just lives on. Or when we brought Kyle Depew and Anna Osbeck of the Illuminator Collective, who were the ones that were part of that Occupy Wall Street movement. And they were the ones that did those 1% projections onto the buildings. We brought him in to do a workshop with Megan at TISO. And the kids learned the techniques that they applied, called urban guerrilla projection techniques. And they learned it. They learned how to do urban projection, which uses technology and art and cinema, light and story, combines it into an urban landscape for social change, right? So they took it in 2016, that workshop. And then on their own, in 2017, when Megan students were worried about defunding the National Endowment for the Arts, she encouraged her students to find a constructive outlet for their anger. And they went back to what they learned from Kyle and Anna about peaceful political expression. And they created images, they wrote statements, they used projection mapping, video and rapid response meme generation. And then they showed up on the plaza with equipment. So I had helped them to purchase the equipment for this workshop. So they had their little tub that they could take to do their projection art. And so they arrived with their tub. I just showed up to support them. And they projected all of these, one after another slides of this kid's artwork, which was just simply done with markers and colored pencils, but it looked big, on the buildings. And then they had a speaker with music. I'm meeting some of them that are now in middle school and have had it every year. And I didn't have that when I was growing up, exposure to this kind of art. What are their minds going to be like? They tell me they see possibilities now that they couldn't see before. It blows all our minds when we see this kind of art. So with kids, this is going to be normal for them. This is their world.
You're listening to Augmented Humanity. We'll be back in just a minute. Welcome back to Augmented Humanity.
Thanks for talking with us about all your work today, Agnes. I wanted to unpack some of the educational work that you're doing and talk a little bit about who you're working with and what it looks like. You've been working in Taos for decades. Taos, like a lot of places in New Mexico, has some sort of specific challenges when you're trying to roll out something high-tech and something very science-y. There's demographic considerations, there's considerations of access to technology, there's considerations of just not having great technology infrastructure, no offense, Taos. So how do you overcome cultural differences as well as problems with the digital divide and problems with equity and access?
I think living in Taos, in a rural community, really made me sensitive to these challenges that exist in the world, right? The underserved areas of the world. Think about it. Taos is far from Santa Fe, far from Albuquerque. It's hard to get access to many things from here. I work with all the schools and, we have students from the Pueblo, we have the Hispanic community, we have different languages being spoken. So I really developed my curriculum in this very unique environment. And then I'm Cuban American. So I also grew up bilingual. I grew up having to recuperate my language skills, Spanish language skills. So I have a lot of real experience about that, about living in two worlds, which a lot of people here have that experience. There were a lot of conditions of what's called the digital divide here in Taos, just screaming at you. I think I always developed curriculum to an audience that didn't automatically have everything. And that really influenced how I developed curriculum. So starting with the SUBE, which was a program to teach Spanish to kids, it started because I saw how many kids didn't know Spanish. They couldn't even speak to their grandparents, right? Then as I got into STEM arts, when you went to art galleries around here, there was no cutting edge science and technology and art here. It was more traditional arts. So I always kind of look for ways to bring access to these things that are out there that I think can be beneficial, that are exciting, that can help us connect to each other, that have the components of my mission, right? My mission is to create art and education programs that help us to feel connected to each other, that help us to understand nature and the world around us, that help us to see how we're interdependent, how everything we do has an effect on everything else. So that kind of being here and developing curriculum was what was a big influence on me developing the work that helps to address that. And then in general, the time that we're living in right now, the whole social media movement and the whole way that you can actually create content is exciting because now anybody can tell their story. And so teaching them to use these tools in an ethical way or in a way that's actually helping to create good in the world is kind of what I'm focusing on. And it's not just me, it's happening all over that there's a shift now. So what's called the digital divide, when they came up with that term, it was all about people just getting access to internet and computer. But now that divide is decreasing, and now everybody's talking about the knowledge gap and the production gap. So the knowledge gap is, okay, now you have access. What are you going to do? Just watch Netflix? What are you going to do with it? How are you going to use the technology? Or do you know how to search? Do you know how to find things for what you want? That whole thing of what you're going to do with it is the focus now, where they're seeing serious gaps all over the world. And then the production gap is moving from just being passive consumers of technology to actual producers of content. It turns out that there's only a small percentage of the population are actually producers of content. And that's why we're not getting diversity of voices, indigenous voices, Hispanic voices. But this is changing. And this is where we as educators need to be focusing. So that's part of the exploration and the experimentation.
I think there's something really crucial there. You said in the earlier segment how just posting a picture and your little caption is not producing content. Why not, though? I was wondering if you could sort of express that in a way that's really meaningful.
Yeah, it's interesting because I saw that recently when I was getting ready to do a panel on digital divide. I hadn't looked up the term in a long time to see how it's evolved in Wikipedia. I was fascinated to see how far it's come and how they've done studies already on how the technology is impacting and what's happening and what's not happening. What I read in terms of the studies is that there's a lot of that going on, not to say that, and I get your point, not to say that that doesn't have a purpose, but what they were saying is there's not a lot of people producing content from diverse cultural backgrounds, from diverse socioeconomic backgrounds, and so forth. So there's a gap in people from diverse backgrounds participating in what becomes the knowledge base. I'm a Facebooker and, posting and everything has its purpose, but it's not the same as really producing content for the world, or using it in ways that are helping to better the world in some way. So that's the area that I focus on. How can we work with kids to see what they can do with it beyond just posting? It comes back to the art. That's really the art and the technology. Art also has gotten kind of pigeonholed, right? Forever. Art is over here, science is over here. But what's happening now with the STEAM movement and what's happening now with this shift towards interdisciplinary transdisciplinarism is the understanding that we all need to use all of these disciplines to communicate, to understand, to express ourselves. And so when you bring art making, creativity into whatever it is that you're doing, you're going to have another kind of impact. It's art making.
I'm a little bit curious about this sort of shift that you're describing in Taos, but more largely from sort of traditional arts where I might go into a gallery in Taos and look at all the beautiful pictures and the beautiful sculptures and the beautiful weavings and be like, oh, that's so beautiful. And then I walk out and my life is unchanged. But I know during the Isaiah exhibition, I remember being in the Albuquerque Museum in this forest of light trees, sending text messages so that I was becoming part of the art. And I was becoming one of the many who had also contributed to this art. Watching the words of all these people that somehow I was connected to, who had been standing in the same room where I was standing and wanted to become a part of the same thing that I wanted to become part of. It's a very different experience. How do you teach that?
Well, I think exposure to it, what you experienced, that feeling that you just described, when kids experience it through the festival or through the art workshops, that's the first step. Now they see what's possible. That was one of the quotes from one of the kids that took the surveys, like, now I see what's possible. That's the first step. They say the first step to change is awareness, right? Exposing them to this. So then through these workshops, they're learning skills. It's really about empowerment. Little by little, they're empowered to say, I can do this. I can do this too. And then they eventually will develop and get the skills themselves. I had that same response when I saw my first participatory projection art piece. And I said, this is something. This can really have impact. It wasn't until I discovered projection art and participatory art that I said, that's what I've been looking for.
What was the first piece that you saw that turned you on?
I remember the day. I was sitting on my kitchen table and my husband was there and my son was there. I just came across these projection mapping pieces that are on buildings for the first time. It was 2010. And at that time, it wasn't in the hands of all the artists. It was only in the hands of like the big production companies that had the money, because the projectors used to cost $10,000. And now they're like $300, $400, $500, $600, right? So back then I watched these big hands on a building and it just crumbled, all those projection mapping that we've gotten so used to now, right? And I was like, I want to do that. That's what I want to do. I remember thinking, I don't know how. And I went on my journey. See, that's the first step. And then if you really want it, you find a way. And now it's easier and easier, and it's going to get even easier to create multimedia, participatory, and interactive virtual reality, mixed reality art. Before you had to have a lot of coding and a lot of programming, and now less and less.
Yeah, now it's much more drag and drop. Is there an example project where you were working with either a class or a group of students where it was like the first time you just felt like they got it and produced something that really just surprised the hell out of you, where you just weren't expecting them to come up with?
Yes. I think it's been working with Marcus Dorninger and the Projecting Particles workshop. That's the one I've been doing long now with Stephen Goldfarb, I mentioned at CERN. Marcus Dorninger is an Austrian projection artist, and he developed a tool called Tag Tool. And Tag Tool is a free app that allows you to paint with your fingers. And it's really easy to learn.
So it's like gesture recognition? Is that what it does?
Yes. It's finger painting, seriously. You control the menu on your left, and on the right, you paint with your fingers. And you can do all kinds of things with it. And I brought him into the Projecting Particles project because the goal, remember, was to teach particle physics through projection art. So I figured particle physics is complex enough to learn, but if I have to do coding as well, the workshop will be like 6 weeks. So I had to find some technology. And I found Marcus when I was in Germany. And so we have been working together ever since. And we do these workshops where Steve is beamed in and he talks to them about physics, and I'll follow up with that through activities. Then Marcus comes in and he teaches them about Tag Tool, and then I follow up on that. And in the end, we do a projection piece onto a building. We did one for the PASEO. We did one in Santa Fe recently. We did it in Havana. Havana was pretty cool too, seeing these kids that had never even touched an iPad. And then there they were on the streets, the girls, I remember them, they were painting onto the building. And so those moments where you see them doing something that they had never done before. And then here in Taos, there was a moment where they created these complex body cosmos images that we had developed like a system for them to take these painted images and put them inside of body traces. And we did a presentation in the cafeteria at the school, and I didn't even take a video of it. We were so last minute, and it was the best ever. And I thought, I could just see them. They were all managing everything. They were painting. They were doing live painting performance. And we transformed the cafeteria into like a multimedia installation like you see at a festival. And I thought, this is something, because this says what you can do in a cafeteria at a school. And parents came and they were just blown away. There was all this music created through GarageBand. I brought a GarageBand artist to teach them how to create this interesting sound effects, and it kind of filled the room. Some of the kids thought it was eerie because it was experimental sound, and exposing them to experimental sound on loop. And the walls were filled with these body trace images, and Feynman quotes were being projected, and it really showed what was possible.
That's just fantastic. It gives me a little bit of hope for the world, if you want to know the truth.
You know what? That's the only way I keep my sanity, is working with kids. Seriously. My purpose is to work with youth. If I have to work with adults, like people have asked me, do you want to do this with university level? And I'm like, no. I want fourth graders, fifth graders. The less corrupt they are in their brain, the more I have hope.
You're listening to Augmented Humanity. We'll be back in just a minute. Welcome back to Augmented Humanity.
Agnes, this is such an exciting conversation, and I'm a little bit curious. You've created installations that are in person, that are participatory, that are virtual, that are international, that are local. How do you go about integrating science and education and art and knowing what the best platform is for communicating that liminal space, for making the scientists feel good and the people who come for something beautiful feel fulfilled, and getting people involved and engaged and learning from it? When somebody comes to you with a project and says, I want to do something cool that shows people the giant web of life and magic in the universe, how do you say, oh yeah, I know exactly the approach we can take? What does that look like?
There's some new terminology now out there that describes it best. We used to use the word interdisciplinary, but there's a new word that people are talking about now, which is transdisciplinary. And if you look at the difference, it's very enlightening. Interdisciplinary is just different disciplines having an exchange. But transdisciplinary is when there are different disciplines coming together around a shared project or topic. And I realized that all along, I really am more of a transdisciplinary artist. And that is kind of how I approach it. What is it we're trying to communicate? What it is that we share, that we want to communicate? And then bring in people from diverse backgrounds and cultures on a topic that we're all passionate about. That's transdisciplinary. And I think that that creates a different climate of collaboration that helps to break down some barriers, as opposed to if you bring in a scientist to talk about science and then they just talk about their exciting project and they're passionate, that's great. But then they go away and there's no connection to you. Or if the artist comes in and shares their work, that's great. But then again, what's the connection? So when the scientist and the artist, and you bring in someone like Taos and talking about, to give an example, the topic that we're exploring now, biodiversity, well, Tiana from Red Willow, the executive director, she gets all excited talking about biodiversity because she's working on food sovereignty and they have a farm, Red Willow Farm, and she talks about how it's important to their culture and how it's important to everyone. And if you bring in the scientist to talk about it, or like the bat biologist that comes and talks about it, he's going to talk about it from his perspective. And then Anna MacArthur, the artist, talking about it. I think that transdisciplinarism is a really powerful tool that I focus on. So I created this kind of model that's guided my curriculum development for STEM art since the very beginning. And there's always been a Venn diagram in the middle, like the interconnection to self, community, the universe, and then narrow it down to a specific topic like biodiversity. And that topic will change, but the interconnection, the idea that we're all connected and how do we create something that shares these values, right? If we come together with that, it does help with the collaboration.
I know several teachers right now, a couple of middle school teachers, 2 high school teachers, that have either come from language arts or fine arts, but they have taken a real active role in trying to bring in the math teachers and the science teachers to then do a class project with all 2 or the 3 of the classes.
Yes, and that doesn't happen a lot. It's only recently. It's very hard. We just did it at the Milagro Middle School with the 7th and 8th grade, and they're very separated into their different subjects, and they did it. Christina Gonzalez is the arts coordinator, and she worked hard. We collaborated with Megan, and we all had to get all these teachers on board, and it takes a lot because the schools are still built to the 20th century classroom model, which is separated disciplines.
Well, especially at the middle school and high school.
Right.
As opposed to the elementary school, which is more the one-room classroom.
Yes, exactly, which is why 4th and 5th grade is perfect because it's right before they go into that segregation. But then when you think of how do I apply this to arts collaborations, it's also the same thing. So if the programmer that I work with or the scientists that I work with, we're all coming together to communicate something that we believe in, as opposed to a work for hire, right? If you're just hiring a coder, it's not the same as you're all coming together to work on something. Then they bring their knowledge to it and their passion to it.
We've been talking about a lot of these things sort of in conceptual ways. So you've developed this curriculum tool at STEMarts. So what does that actually look like? If I was going to use this curriculum in a very practical way, what do I actually get and how would I go about using it?
So one of the things that I've been doing over the years is getting all of these ideas and all of these resources and all of these artists that I've worked with through all the festivals. They're all documented on this website. So you can go and look at the artists and select one, and then you go into the artist page, and then you hear about their work. So I'm trying to simulate the experience of going to a festival or some multimedia experience that you might have nowadays. And the student can go in and learn about the artist, but then the teacher has all these tools. They show them how, through this artist, they're going to learn about nanotechnology. Through that artist, they're going to learn about particle physics. Through this artist, they're going to learn about quantum biology. And it kind of extracts and gives them lesson guides or activity guides. And it also provides like standard alignments, which I realized early on, if you want a teacher to actually do it during school time, it better be aligned to the standards. And there's just tons of tools, and it's all free. Any teacher can come to the site and pick a festival or pick one of the STEMarts LAB projects, then go in and pick the artist. Everything always revolves around the artist. That's the other thing that's very unique about the STEMarts curriculum tool. So even though it's an interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary approach, it's what I call artist-led. So the artist is the core, the center point. And why is that? As an artist, I can tell you that artists actually do a lot of research in their work. And a lot of people don't know this. They do research and they spend their whole lifetime on one topic because that's what they're passionate about. Of course, it manifests into different exhibits and so forth. But if you really dig deep into that artist's work, there's something that they've thoroughly researched. And so if you start there, for example, working with Anna MacArthur lately, the most recent project that we did, she's been working for years in that intersection of art and ecology and biodiversity and climate change. She comes and we build this curriculum around it. Well, students can learn so much through this artist's lens about biodiversity. So then building out from the artist's work, we go out into the community. So for the Taos Land Trust Project, we partnered with the Taos Pueblo, as I was mentioning, to bring in people to speak about biodiversity from the indigenous traditional ecological knowledge. And so students can go on the website and click on the videos and listen to Dr. Greg Cajete, who wrote the book on Native Science, and Tiana, who's running the Red Willow. And they can hear the bat biologists talk about it, and they hear the different voices.
So does the STEMarts Lab platform also provide pointers or resources for the tools that they might need to do a project or an activity? I mean, it's not just looking at stuff on a web page.
Absolutely. So what happens is then they drill in, and then there's something called the STEMarts design tool. It has the different stages of the design process: brainstorm, explore, research, experiment, get some feedback, and then share. So every artist page has this design tool, and then it has a specific project or activities to work on. And it's not like I'm creating content. It really still is very much an open source tool. So there's something underneath that called the BioSTEAM or the STEMarts Wiki, and that has links that we curate. I developed this with Anita McEwen back during the Isaiah curriculum tool, and it's still stayed the same. It's just gotten better over the years. So what happens is the student goes in there under the, say, the research stage, and down below there's all these links to the research that we found that relates to that artist's work and that topic. And then for the experiment part, it has do-it-yourself activities, it has STEAM activities, it has science experiments, and then in the end, a very simple project that anybody as a class can do together. So it has all of these tools ready to go to do activities using this model.
I'm thinking of all the kids casting around for self-directed learning activities this year. It just sounds like a heck of a lot of fun. But, I want to go back to your STEM arts learning model because I'm sort of fascinated with it. On your model, you have the outcome as students developing divergent and lateral thinking, learning to use art to understand concepts and express ideas. That's a pretty cool outcome. You have a couple of outcomes that are like students develop valuable STEM and 21st century skills. Absolutely. Students develop understanding of connection between STEM, society, and the natural world. That's sort of a critical thinking outcome that is really exciting as a teacher, to make those connections among disciplines. But the last one is under real world applications. And the outcome is that students perceive themselves as caretakers of the planet and local/global citizens, developing positive values and ethics for collaboration and community engagement. Now, I just got to say, that's a huge outcome.
Okay, I got an example of that. So when we did one of those workshops at this TISA school where we brought in a physics teacher, Shane Wood, and we beamed in Steve from CERN. But in 2016 or 17, we added an indigenous component to the Projecting Particles project. So I go to Standing Rock and I see Steve Tamayo there, this man who's putting up a teepee with the students, and he's explaining the universe and astronomy to the kids through the indigenous perspective. And I asked him if he'd like to come and join our team. And he said, yeah, I love Taos. So he came and we did our first workshop. And at the end of the workshop, where the physics teacher and him talking about the native worldview, and I asked this little boy, Noah, what did you get out of this workshop? Now remember, he's heard everything. Big Bang, Higgs boson particles, standard model, and he's done native games with Steve and so forth. And he says, well, when my brother went to step on a bug, I used to not even think about it. And now I said, stop, you can't kill that bug. And I thought, there, you see, a little thing like that. That's the one thing he thought of. And Steve talks about the respect for all species and that we're all connected. It's not like he talks specifically about a bug, but he did talk about the spider as a very important symbol for the Lakota people, right? The dream catcher. This is definitely one of what's called the long-term outcome. To me, that's a sign that it's definitely happening. And I've seen it in many, many ways.
It occurs to me that additional component of arts and storytelling makes it a meaningful, individualized experience, where the learner becomes transformed in a way that science by itself doesn't really achieve. In your model, you have this under real-world applications. It seems like it's in the context of either these virtual collaborations or these community events. What kind of role do you see of just the magic of bringing so many people together and contributing to this moral change?
Yeah, that's a great question. So again, to use that workshop as an example, at the end of it, Steve Tamayo put up a teepee at the community center here in Taos. And of course, the kids helped to put up the teepee. We had a public event. We flew in Stephen Goldfarb for this from CERN, and they each spoke. And I had some high schoolers that had already gone through the program, and they became mentors, and they helped to take all the student work that was created to project onto the teepee. And then the public and the family came. And when it goes from just a classroom activity to something very real, where they have to now get serious because they have to present what they learned and what they created. When they saw their work projected onto this teepee, it's the same feeling we artists get. And then their parents and the community get the feeling that they get when they're blown away, when they see something like that happen. And they see these ideas about Native science and Western science being communicated in this way. So that's why I put it under real world applications. That's when you really see what they got out of it.
What you said about how the older students mentored the younger students, that's actually also a very real world application.
Absolutely.
It sounds like you're creating, whether you meant to or not, a sustainable model.
We do have a mentorship program. I have a video, and you can see the high school students there, and she's interviewed and she's, what do you think of this? It's awesome. And she's there with her projector, and she was curating the whole thing onto the teepees. Yeah.
That's a really positive note to end the program on. Agnes, thank you so much for sharing this time with us today.
Thank you, guys. You're so wonderful. Thanks for appreciating what I do, really.
And if you would like more information about Agnes and her work, you can visit STEMarts.com online or AgnesChavez.com. Augmented Humanity is a program of the New Mexico Humanities Council produced in partnership with KUNM-FM. You can visit us online and find out more about our programs at nmhumanities.org. Our theme music comes courtesy James Whiten, and we've had production assistance from Tristan Klum.